The MV Doña Paz was more than just a ship. It was a lifeline. For countless Filipino families, workers, and students, this inter-island ferry, operated by Sulpicio Lines, was the primary way to travel between the islands. It was an older vessel, built in Japan back in 1963, and had seen many years of service before being sold to the Philippines in 1975. Despite its age, it was a familiar sight in the busy ports, connecting Manila with the eastern Visayas, often making stops in places like Tacloban and Catbalogan. Every trip carried a mix of people, from those heading home for the holidays to others commuting for work or school, or relying on it to bridge the watery gaps between their lives. On that fateful day, December 19, 1987, the Doña Paz was preparing for its journey from Tacloban to Manila, with a scheduled stop in Catbalogan. The port was a hive of activity, a usual scene for a departure day, especially so close to Christmas. Passengers shuffled aboard, carrying their bags, greeting friends and finding their spots. The atmosphere was light, filled with the buzz of anticipation that comes with travel, particularly during the festive season. People laughed, children played, and the promise of home or a holiday celebration hung in the air. While the official passenger manifest listed around 500 people, it was an open secret that these ferries often carried far more than their registered capacity. Overcrowding was a common issue, a silent risk that many accepted out of necessity or a desire to get where they needed to be. No one on board or at the bustling dockside could have imagined the horror that awaited them. As the Doña Paz pulled away from Tacloban, the early hours of the journey were uneventful. The sea was calm, a peaceful expanse reflecting the night sky. Many passengers quickly settled into their bunks, eager to catch some sleep before reaching their destination. Others stayed up, chatting with newfound friends, playing cards, or simply watching the dark water slip by from the decks. The ship moved steadily, a comforting hum of engines filling the background. There were no immediate signs of trouble, no rough seas or mechanical failures to alarm anyone. Yet, beneath this seemingly calm surface, there were subtle cracks in the system. The vessel's age, the known issue of overloading, and possibly even the fatigue of some crew members were all elements that, while not immediately apparent, contributed to a fragile state. It was a journey like many others, a routine passage across the sea, yet this time it was set to become anything but routine. The ship sailed onward, cutting through the dark waters, unaware that another vessel, equally routine in its movements, was on a collision course just hours away. The peaceful hum of the engines was a prelude, not to a safe arrival, but to an unimaginable tragedy. Every mile covered, every wave passed, brought them closer to a moment that would etch itself into history as one of the deadliest maritime disasters. The passengers slept, dreamed, and laughed, completely oblivious to the unseen forces converging in the darkness. Meanwhile, out on the open sea, another vessel was making its way through the night. This was the MT Vector, a small oil tanker. It wasn't designed for passengers, but for carrying fuel. On this particular trip, it was loaded with 800 barrels of refined petroleum products, including gasoline and kerosene. The tanker, like the Doña Paz, was also an older ship, built in 1980, and had its own history of maintenance checks and routes. Its job was to transport fuel between different islands, a vital but often overlooked part of the country's infrastructure. The crew on board the Vector would have been going about their usual duties, monitoring the gauges, checking the course, perhaps some of them feeling the same end-of-year fatigue as anyone working through the holidays. There was nothing to suggest that their routine journey was about to intersect with something truly catastrophic. As the hours passed, both the Doña Paz and the MT Vector were heading towards a specific point in the Tablas Strait, an important waterway that connects the Sibuyan Sea with the South China Sea. The night was dark, which is common in these waters, and visibility would have been limited. Navigating solely by sight would have been tough, meaning both crews relied heavily on their radar and other navigation tools. It's in these conditions that human error becomes a bigger risk. Maybe someone wasn't paying close enough attention, or perhaps the equipment wasn't working as it should have been. The exact details are still debated, but the critical point is that these two ships, each on its own path, were slowly but surely closing in on each other. It was like two blindfolded people walking in a straight line, completely unaware of the other, until it was too late. What makes the approaching disaster even more tragic is the series of missed warnings and fatal assumptions. How could two vessels, both equipped with radar and staffed by trained crews, fail to see each other until it was too late? Investigations later suggested a combination of factors. On the Doña Paz, it was reported that only one officer was on the bridge, a third mate, and that the ship's captain was reportedly in his cabin, watching television or sleeping. The lookout, a critical role for spotting other vessels, was either not present or not performing his duties effectively. The radar system on the Doña Paz was said to be working, but if no one was watching it, or if it was misinterpreted, it might as well have been off. On the MT Vector, the situation wasn't much better. Reports indicated that the ship was also operating without a proper lookout. The captain of the Vector was also not on the bridge at the time of the collision. It seems both ships were navigating on autopilot, or at least with a severe lack of active human supervision. This was not a sudden, unpredictable event. It was a slow, steady convergence that could have been avoided with a simple change of course, a clear radar reading, or even a single pair of vigilant eyes. But none of that happened. The moments leading up to the impact were filled with silence, not the sound of alarms or shouts, but the quiet, rhythmic churn of engines carrying hundreds of lives towards an unseen, unimaginable horror. The lack of communication, the failure to follow basic maritime rules, and the apparent complacency on both bridges created a vacuum of awareness. This void allowed the two vessels to continue their paths, sealing the fate of thousands, all because no one seemed to notice the other ship until the very last second. The silence was shattered by a sudden, violent jolt. It wasn't just a bump. It was a tearing, grinding sound that vibrated through the entire structure of the Doña Paz. Passengers who were awake were thrown from their seats, while those sleeping were jolted awake in confusion. The ship shuddered, a deep, sickening vibration that felt like it was ripping apart from the inside. Many mistook it for hitting a reef or a submerged object at first. There was a brief moment of stunned silence, a collective intake of breath before the real chaos began. On the MT Vector, the impact was equally sudden and brutal. The tanker, though larger, also buckled under the force. The collision tore a gaping hole in the hull of the Vector, right into its cargo tanks. In an instant, hundreds of thousands of liters of highly flammable petroleum products, gasoline and kerosene, began spewing out into the dark waters of the Tablas Strait. The sheer volume of the spill was immense, creating a slick that quickly spread around both vessels. Then came the inferno. It was almost instantaneous. The volatile petroleum, mixed with the friction and sparks from the collision, ignited with a terrifying whoosh. A massive fireball erupted, a towering wall of flame that swallowed the night sky. The heat was immediate and intense, searing everything in its path. The fire didn't just stay on the Vector, it spread like a liquid monster across the oil-covered water, engulfing the Doña Paz in a matter of seconds. The ferry, already damaged and carrying its own fuel, became a giant torch. Passengers on the Doña Paz screamed. The initial confusion turned into sheer terror as the flames licked up the sides of the ship, consuming everything with frightening speed. People scrambled, pushing and shoving, trying to get away from the rapidly spreading blaze. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning fuel and human panic. The cries were desperate, a symphony of fear and disbelief. For those in the lower decks, the situation was even more dire. Many passengers were asleep in their cabins, oblivious to the collision until the smoke and heat began to seep in. The fire spread rapidly through the ship's interior, fueled by bedding, furniture, and the ship's own structure. Smoke quickly filled the narrow corridors, making it impossible to see or breathe. The heat became unbearable, blistering skin and making metal glow. People stumbled through the darkness, coughing and gagging, trying to find an exit. The sense of being trapped was overwhelming. Doors jammed, stairwells became chimneys for the smoke and fire, and the sheer number of people trying to escape at once created bottlenecks. The lower decks quickly became a death trap. Many woke up only to find their escape routes already blocked by flames or thick, choking smoke. The desperate struggle to find a way out was often futile. They were caught between the crushing weight of the ship and the relentless consuming fire. The screams from below deck were muffled by the roar of the fire and the screams from above, a horrifying testament to the rapid, brutal nature of the disaster. The fire didn't just burn, it consumed, leaving no time for thought, only for instinctual, desperate reactions. The Doña Paz, once a symbol of inter-island travel, became a monstrous burning wreck. Flames licked hundreds of feet into the night sky, casting an eerie orange glow across the water. The ship was a floating inferno, a giant torch in the middle of the dark sea. The intense heat was a physical force pushing people back, making the very air shimmer and dance. Toxic smoke, thick and black, billowed from every opening, filling the lungs of anyone who dared to breathe it in. Passengers who had managed to scramble onto the upper decks found themselves in a new kind of hell. They were trapped, surrounded by fire on all sides, the metal deck beneath their feet growing hotter by the second. The screams of those below deck were now joined by the desperate cries of those above, their voices hoarse from smoke and terror. Panic was absolute. People ran back and forth looking for an escape, any escape, from the rapidly advancing flames. They tried to find a way to the railing, to the open air, but the fire was everywhere. It spread along the wooden decks, consumed the plastic seating, and melted the metal fixtures. The air was filled with the sound of cracking, exploding materials and the constant roar of the fire. The ship was visibly breaking apart, groaning under the immense heat and stress. Then came the horrifying realization: there were no lifeboats. Or rather, the few that were there were either rusted shut, tied down with ropes that wouldn't budge, or simply inaccessible because of the fire. Some lifeboats were clearly non-functional, damaged from years of neglect. Even if they had been operational, the sheer number of people meant there wouldn't have been enough for everyone. The life rafts, if any existed, were nowhere to be seen or were already consumed by the flames. Adding to the terror, there were very few life vests. Passengers frantically searched, ripping open storage bins, but found almost nothing. The few vests discovered were quickly snatched up, leading to desperate struggles among those who found them. This wasn't just a fire, it was a death trap, made worse by a complete lack of basic safety equipment. The devastating truth dawned on them. Their escape options were basically zero. There was no way off this burning ship, no safe haven. The choice became stark and brutal: burn alive on the ship or jump into the sea of fire below. The water around the Doña Paz was no longer just water. It was a swirling, burning slick of oil and fuel, a continuation of the inferno. Yet faced with the unbearable heat and the certainty of being consumed by the flames on board, many chose the lesser of two evils. People began to jump. It was a horrifying spectacle. Individuals, some holding children, some clutching onto loved ones, made the impossible decision. They climbed over the railing, their faces streaked with soot and tears, and plunged into the blazing sea. The moment they hit the water, the burning oil clung to them, igniting their clothes and skin. The toxic fumes rising from the burning slick were suffocating, burning their throats and lungs. The impact of the jump itself, from such a height, was enough to injure many. But even worse was the immediate agony of hitting the burning oil. Screams turned into gurgles as some were instantly engulfed. Others thrashed desperately, trying to swim away from the worst of the flames, but the oil was everywhere. It was a sea of fire, and those who jumped were entering another part of the inferno, trading one burning prison for another. The scene was one of unimaginable despair, a desperate, futile struggle against an overwhelming, fiery enemy. Those who managed to survive the initial impact with the burning water now faced a new, terrifying battle for their lives. The sea itself had become an enemy. The burning oil clung to everything, turning clothes into fiery shrouds and skin into agonizing canvases of pain. Every breath was a struggle against the acrid smoke and fumes that rose from the inferno. Many had swallowed the toxic, oily water during their desperate leaps, their lungs burning from the inside. The sheer physical effort of staying afloat in such chaotic conditions, surrounded by debris and the bodies of others, was immense. The current, though not strong, was enough to pull them away from the immediate wreckage, but also further into the vast, dark ocean. Hypothermia began to set in for those who escaped the immediate flames, their bodies shivering uncontrollably, in the cooler pockets of water. But then there were the sharks. The disaster had drawn them in, their dark fins cutting through the water, adding another layer of primal fear to an already unbearable situation. Survivors recounted seeing shadows beneath them, hearing splashes and screams that suddenly went silent. It was a constant, terrifying calculus of risk: endure the burning oil, freeze in the cold spots, or become prey to the unseen predators lurking below. People tried to find anything that floated: a piece of wood, a mangled chair, even another body. Anything to keep their heads above the deadly surface. Amidst this hellish chaos, incredible acts of heroism emerged. In a situation where every person was fighting for their own survival, some found the strength to help others. A father held his child above the water, sacrificing his own strength to keep the little one from sinking. Strangers clung to each other, forming small, desperate rafts of humanity, sharing whatever meager support they could find. A young man, barely a swimmer himself, pulled an elderly woman onto a floating piece of wreckage, shielding her from the worst of the flames with his own body. These were not grand, heroic gestures from movies. They were raw, instinctual acts of kindness born from the deepest despair. They were moments of shared resilience, brief sparks of humanity against an overwhelming tide of death. But even these acts came with a heavy cost, demanding every ounce of physical and emotional strength from people already pushed past their limits. The psychological toll was immense. Witnessing the suffering, hearing the cries of those who couldn't be saved, and knowing that loved ones were lost to the flames or the sea, left an indelible mark on their minds. As the hours dragged on, the survivors in the water faced an agonizing wait for help. The night was endless, punctuated only by the crackling of the distant fire and the muted sounds of desperation. Every shadow seemed to be a rescue boat, every distant light a sign of hope. But none came. The sheer scale of the disaster, the remote location and the darkness, meant that official rescue efforts would be slow to mobilize. Each passing minute chipped away at their resolve, draining their strength and extinguishing their hope. The cold gnawed at their bones, the burning oil continued to irritate their skin, and the hunger and thirst became unbearable. When the first hints of dawn finally appeared on the horizon, it brought with it a grim, horrifying clarity. The rising sun revealed the full extent of the devastation. A vast expanse of debris, burnt wreckage, and countless bodies floating on the oil-slicked water. The Doña was now a charred, smoking hulk, barely recognizable. The sea, once a symbol of life and transport, had become a mass grave. For the few still clinging to life, the sight was both a confirmation of their worst fears and a fragile glimmer of hope that they might finally be seen. Their bodies were battered, their minds traumatized, but a faint pulse of life still beat within them, waiting for rescue. The physical and emotional deterioration of those still alive was stark and visible, their faces gaunt, eyes wide with the horror they had endured. They were survivors, but deeply scarred by the night's events. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky with a desperate, pale light, the first responders finally arrived. These weren't official Coast Guard vessels, not at first. Instead, it was a scattering of local fishing boats, their crews drawn by the distant smoke plume and the terrible rumors that had started to spread through the small coastal communities. What they encountered was a scene beyond anything they could have imagined. The sea was no longer just water. It was a vast, oily canvas littered with debris. Charred bits of the Doña, personal belongings, and, most horrifyingly, bodies, floated everywhere. The air hung heavy with the smell of burnt oil and something far more sickening. The fishermen, hardened by years at sea, were visibly shaken. They moved slowly, their usual boisterous calls replaced by hushed, urgent whispers. Their small boats, designed for hauling nets, now became makeshift rescue craft. They began the grim, painstaking work of navigating through the wreckage, searching for any sign of life. Each bobbing head, each faint call, was a miracle. They pulled survivors from the water, their bodies slick with oil, faces contorted by shock and exhaustion. These initial rescues were chaotic, driven by raw human compassion rather than organized protocols. There was no clear command, just people helping people in the face of unimaginable horror. As more boats arrived, including some from the Philippine Navy and Coast Guard, the true scale of the tragedy began to unfold. The overwhelming number of casualties quickly became apparent. For every survivor they pulled from the water, there were dozens, then hundreds of bodies. The grim task of recovery began in earnest. Divers started to explore the submerged parts of the Doña Paz, though the heat and the unstable wreckage made it incredibly dangerous. The burnt hulk of the ship sat like a tombstone, a silent testament to the lives lost within its steel shell. Initial estimates of the death toll were horrifying, but even those numbers would later prove to be tragically low, escalating dramatically as the days turned into weeks. It was clear this wasn't just an accident, it was a catastrophe of epic proportions. The first survivors brought to shore were immediately overwhelmed by medical teams and families desperate for news. Their stories were fragmented, filled with gaps where trauma had erased memory. They spoke of a sudden jolt, a flash of fire, then the impossible choice, burn or jump. One young woman, her voice hoarse from smoke inhalation, recounted seeing families swallowed by the flames, unable to escape the lower decks. A man with severe burns on his arms described the burning oil on the water, how it clung to skin and clothes, making escape almost impossible. He spoke of others, less fortunate, who simply gave up, their strength failing as the fire raged around them. Another survivor, an elderly woman, simply repeated, "No lifeboats, no lifeboats," her eyes wide and unfocused. Her words echoed the accounts of many others, painting a chilling picture of a ship completely unprepared for disaster. The emotional impact of these stories on the rescuers and the public was immense. Each testimony was a punch to the gut, a raw, unfiltered glimpse into the hell endured by those on board. These were not just statistics, they were individuals, each with a life, a family, and a story that ended in the most horrific way imaginable. The initial rescue efforts, though brave and tireless, were just the beginning of a long, painful journey to understand what had happened and why so many had died. The shock waves of this disaster were just starting to ripple across the nation and around the world. The immediate aftermath of the Doña Paz and MT Vector collision demanded a full and thorough investigation. Maritime authorities, both local and international, quickly launched formal inquiries. Their goal was to pinpoint the exact cause of the collision, but also to identify all the contributing factors that led to such an unimaginable loss of life. Investigators meticulously examined every piece of available evidence. They looked at the ship's logs, which surprisingly were incomplete or even missing for crucial periods. They delved into maintenance records, trying to understand the condition of both vessels. Crew qualifications and training were scrutinized, as were the procedures that were supposed to be in place for safe navigation. What they uncovered was a horrifying web of negligence and outright corruption. The Doña Paz, it turned out, was a ticking time bomb. It was chronically overcrowded, often carrying thousands more passengers than its legal capacity. This wasn't an accident, it was standard practice. Safety equipment was largely a myth. Lifeboats were either rusted shut, non-existent, or packed with cargo instead of emergency supplies. Life vests were scarce, often locked away or too old to be effective. Many of the crew members, including those on the bridge during the collision, had expired licenses or were performing duties they weren't properly trained for. There were even reports that the captain was not on the bridge at the time of the impact, instead watching a movie or socializing. The MT Vector was not much better. While it was a tanker, a vessel designed to carry dangerous cargo, its own safety protocols were shockingly lax. Its radar system was reportedly not working properly, and its crew also showed signs of inadequate training and vigilance. The fact that two such vessels, both with significant safety issues, could be operating in busy shipping lanes, was a stark indictment of the regulatory bodies. It became clear that inspection processes were either deeply flawed or compromised by corruption, allowing shipping companies to cut corners with devastating consequences. These revelations sent shockwaves through the nation and the global maritime community. As the investigations continued, legal battles inevitably began. Families of the victims, shattered by their loss, sought justice and compensation. Lawsuits were filed against Sulpicio Lines, the owner of the Doña Paz, and against the owners of the MT Vector. These legal proceedings were long and incredibly arduous, adding to the suffering of the victims' families. The companies initially tried to minimize their liability, but the overwhelming evidence of negligence made their position increasingly untenable. The global outcry was immense, fueled by media reports that detailed the horrific conditions on board the Doña Paz and the systemic failures that led to the disaster. There was a strong and unified demand for improved maritime safety standards, not just in the Philippines but worldwide. The Doña Paz became a tragic symbol of what happens when profit is prioritized over human lives, and when regulations are ignored or circumvented. The fight for accountability was not just about the past. It was about ensuring that such a catastrophe would never happen again. The legal and moral weight of the disaster pressed heavily on all involved, forcing a painful reckoning with the true cost of neglect. The Doña Paz disaster stands as the world's worst peacetime maritime tragedy, a grim marker in history. Its impact on the Philippines was profound, leaving an indelible scar on the national psyche, and it sent ripples through the global maritime community. The grief and trauma for the families who lost loved ones were immeasurable, a wound that would never fully heal. For many, the memory of that fiery night, the desperate jumps into the burning sea, and the agonizing wait for rescue became a permanent fixture in their lives. In the immediate aftermath, there was a global call for change. The sheer scale of the loss, coupled with the glaring evidence of negligence, forced a reckoning within the maritime industry. Governments and international bodies began to re-examine existing regulations. One of the most significant changes was the stricter enforcement and revision of passenger manifests. No longer could ships carry an unknown number of people. Accurate passenger lists became a mandatory requirement, aiming to prevent the kind of massive underreporting that plagued the Doña Paz. There were also significant improvements in safety equipment requirements. Regulations were tightened regarding the number and condition of lifeboats, life rafts, and life vests. Inspections became more rigorous, at least on paper, to ensure that these vital pieces of equipment were not only present, but also functional and easily accessible in an emergency. Crew training also saw an overhaul. There was a greater emphasis on emergency procedures, firefighting, and evacuation protocols. The idea was to equip crews with the skills and knowledge to respond effectively when disaster struck, rather than being overwhelmed by it. However, the implementation and enforcement of these new regulations proved to be an ongoing challenge, especially in developing nations where corruption and lax oversight could still undermine safety efforts. The Doña Paz served as a brutal reminder that regulations, no matter how well-intentioned, are only as effective as their enforcement. The global maritime community continues to grapple with these issues, striving for a balance between economic pressures and the paramount need for human safety. The memory of the Doña Paz and its thousands of victims must never fade. It is a powerful reminder of the human cost of negligence and complacency. Memorials have been erected, documentaries produced, and books written, all serving to honor the lost and to ensure that the lessons learned from this catastrophe are passed down through generations. These acts of remembrance are crucial, not just for the families of the victims, but for the entire world. They stand as a testament to the lives cut short, and a constant plea for vigilance and responsibility in all aspects of maritime travel. The story of the Doña Paz is a tragic narrative of systemic failures, individual errors, and the devastating consequences that follow when human lives are undervalued. It is a story that compels us to advocate for safer seas, to demand accountability from those in power, and to never forget the faces of those who perished in the fiery waters of the Tablas Strait. The hope endures that through remembering the lost, we can build a future where such preventable tragedies are truly a thing of the past. The Doña Paz, though gone, continues to speak, urging us to learn, to change, and to protect.